Thank you. I don't know about you, but I have been really looking forward to this particular session because it's so relevant to what I do, but also what you all do, especially when we're working in a volunteer capacity. So I'd like to introduce Dr. Tatyana Kholodkov. Is that right? All right. Who is a licensed clinical psychologist and owner of Project Yes. She is co-chair of the North Carolina Disaster Mental Health Work Group and active with the Disaster Action Team of the American Red Cross. Dr. Kholodkov incorporates different approaches to address emotional and physical well-being with an emphasis on evidence-based treatment, including CBT, ACT or ACT, mindfulness, DBT, and motivational interviewing. Dr. Kholodkov frequently works with clients around emotions, including allowing for greater understanding of emotional experiences and learning how to reduce emotional suffering. She sees adults with a wide range of concerns, including depression, anxiety, sleep difficulties, relationship problems, complicated health issues, loss, chronic pain, and loss transitions. She has specialized in treatment of trauma and PTSD, anxiety disorders, and couples therapy. Thank you so much for being willing to spend an hour with us. We really appreciate it, and I will turn it over to Dr. Kholodkov.
Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome. I'm excited that you are all here today. I'm pretty passionate about talking with you, and I'm just really thrilled that more and more providers that are providing care to individuals at times of disaster or around disaster experiences are interested in the psychological piece of it. I'm quite passionate about volunteering with the Red Cross, but as was stated in the introduction, I also do some work on a state level to make sure that we're providing good quality care, and I provide consultation around these topics. So my objective today is to give you a super brief overview of psychological first aid. Just curious, by a show of hands, how many people here have ever taken psychological first aid? One person. Okay, fantastic. So just to let you know, typically just in the Red Cross model, this is like a 3.5-hour training. We've consolidated it to a very, very short class. In this format, this is what's delivered to people right before they go out on the field, like the day they're arriving, and so that they're trying to do the best that they can to provide some of these principles of psychological first aid. So I'm hoping that this course will give you some valuable tools you can take home with you. Let me see if I can keep this going. So, but just a tiny bit about me. I volunteer with the Durham chapter of the Red Cross, the Central North Carolina chapter. I formerly was the mental health lead for the entire eastern side of the state, which is an impossible volunteer position to have while you work full-time, so I don't do that anymore. But in terms of other experiences that I've had, I ran the disaster mental health team across the whole state during Hurricane Florence for 2 weeks. I was in Hurricane Harvey before the hurricane landed and ran operations there for Houston and the surrounding 12 counties for 2 weeks. So I've gone to some larger scale disasters, Louisiana, obviously the explosion here more locally, and I basically work on a number of different levels, from all the way boots on the ground working with clients all the way up to running teams of people and supporting workforce wellness. So towards the end of this talk, I've included some slides that are not typically covered in the Red Cross model, because I think it's really important for us to consider the role of things like vicarious trauma, what it's like to be hearing people with high levels of distress to be talking about their concerns, and how that can actually start to become our own baggage that we carry. So I'll talk a little bit about that and resilience as well. So the course purpose is basically to enable you to provide basic care, comfort, and support to people who are experiencing disaster-related stress, and also to know when it might be appropriate to refer a client to other resources. Now, because this is mostly based off of a Red Cross presentation, it's frequently going to be referring to a disaster mental health worker. That's certainly an option that you have, and I can talk to you about how would you possibly access that for a client. But I will also give you at the end of the presentation a lot of other resources you may choose to use with your clients to support them. And you have to follow your own entity or institutional policies in terms of when do you make make a referral. So I will defer to you and your ethics around that. Main objectives are to be able to provide immediate support to people experiencing stress by using these PFA principles, psychological first aid, and know, again, when to get additional support, including for yourself or other coworkers. And lastly, an additional objective that was requested for this presentation is so that you can recognize signs of vicarious trauma and understand or learn how to access some of your individual resilience factors. So first, what is psychological first aid? Psychological first aid is the practice of recognizing and appropriately responding when people are experiencing disaster-related stress. So when working with an individual that has experienced a disaster, I imagine that most of the clients that you personally are serving, they actually already have a lot of other things going on. Maybe multiple other layers of trauma, lots of obstacles. And so from a psychological first aid perspective, the question isn't, really like what's wrong with you, it's what's happened to you, right? So that's really what we're trying to understand is how do we aid this person in the context of this additional unique experience they may have gone through. And the reason that this is important is we are trying to foster an environment of compassion for people who have survived disasters and also people who work in disaster areas or in a disaster response. By being able to create a more compassionate environment, it might also enhance the work you are doing with your clients. I imagine there's times in which you ask a client to do something or to follow through on something. You work so hard to get everything set up, and then they don't show up, or they don't make that phone call, or don't submit something, and you're probably asking yourself, well, why is this happening? Well, one of the reasons why it might be happening is they're in a state of additional distress, and that thing that might seem so simple is really rather overwhelming to them. We'll kind of come back to that. So first of all, awareness, attitude, and actions are all important aspects of providing psychological first aid. And when you're providing psychological first aid, it's first important to gain awareness of what you bring to that interaction with a client, such as your own experiences, any biases that you may have, your own current level of stress as you are working with the client. That's also very challenging if you are responding and you yourself are in a community that's dealing with a disaster. You might be carrying some things, and that's impacting the interactions that you're having, and we need to be aware of that. We also need to have an awareness of what the client or that coworker or whoever else that you're working with may need, even if they can't tell you exactly in words what they might be needing. And we have to figure out how to best respond to that person. So awareness of these things can help us assume an attitude that's necessary to provide the best support that we can. We really try to meet our clients where they are at. And in order to provide psychological first aid effectively, it's important to first and foremost adopt an attitude of respect, care, concern, and openness to differences. Now, I imagine all of you, given that you are volunteering, are already trying to bring that spirit into the work that you're doing. But I can imagine there's times in which you're sitting with a client and they are telling you about a number of different things that are hard or stressful, and you're just trying to get to that thing you're there to meet with them. And in psychological first aid, we might invite ourselves to back up a little bit and really try to tune in into what basic needs this client may have that are not being met. Because until we attend to that, or at least listen and maybe help them hold that, it won't be possible to solve some of these other issues we're trying to work with them. So we are going to come back to this later on, but there's these 12 psychological first aid actions. These are different things that you can do that are kind of under this umbrella of psychological first aid. So these are the actions. We're going to go into them in a little bit more detail. But the idea is simply to provide basic care, comfort, and support to individuals who are experiencing disaster-related stress. And there's some ways we can do that that's very practical. First and foremost, we obviously need to take care of ourselves, because if our bucket is too full, we're not going to be very patient or open or receptive. There might be something very important that client is trying to tell us, but we're missing it, or we're rushing a little bit too much. And particularly, again, if you are in a community that's impacted by a disaster, it's important to ask yourself if what you have on your plate is too much, and as much as you feel called to volunteer, maybe that isn't the best time to do it. And we'll come back to that again at the end, but taking care of ourselves first and foremost helps with all these other additional steps. When we first connect with the client, we really want to try to make a warm, empathic connection, help them be seen as a human being, really trying to listen, and helping people try to feel safe, which might be very difficult to do if you don't know where you're going to sleep, or can you get back to your job, or when is your child's school going to be open because it's closed, or your possessions are destroyed, or your pet ran off in the middle of the storm. There's so many different things that could be going on with a person, but you are there, a caring presence that might be providing calm, compassionate conversation and helping that person just regain a little bit more of sense of normalcy in their life. We obviously want to also meet people's basic needs. It's very difficult to have somebody try to listen to me if they need a drink of water, haven't slept very much, are really worried about a loved one and don't know if that loved one is safe. They're not going to be very attentive. So we'll talk about some resources you can have to even meet those needs. We want to listen. When we give reassurance, we want it to be realistic, especially in a time of disaster. We don't want to say everything is going to be okay, because it might not be, or whatever version of okay is different than what the client has experienced before. And we'll come back to some of these other ones that are on here, such as encouraging good coping or helping people connect. Obviously, when we start a conversation, we also then need to figure out how do we end it. And it can feel very incomplete to be working with someone who's highly distressed and you're finishing the conversation and they're still really distressed. But that's still something we might need to do, is say, I'm sorry, I know this is really hard, and let's pick up from this place the next time that we meet. Or, I'm sorry, I don't have a solution for this particular problem, but I'm really hopeful that you can access some of these other resources. Or maybe sometimes all we can say is, I'm sorry, this is so hard. And we still have to find a way to end the conversation and take care of all the other people that we might need to take care of. So in terms of taking care of ourselves, there's sort of the ongoing taking care of ourselves and the additional taking care of that shows up when we are working during disaster times. I sort of think about it as you've got your car and you need to regularly take it for an oil change. That's your more general emotion regulation. And then there's sometimes where your tire pops and you need to intervene on it right there and then. And those are two different sort of sets of tools and resources that you might need to have. So taking care of ourselves includes maintaining a healthy routine, knowing our limits, having a way to maintain hope, which can be very hard when we're dealing repeatedly with a lot of distress or circumstances that are difficult to try to fix for someone. So we need to learn to take a step back, connect to things in our life that are still good or still meaningful. We obviously need sufficient rest. None of us are particularly great if we are deprived of rest. I don't know if you've ever seen a toddler without a nap in the middle of a grocery store. We are just like that. We also need to know when to leave our shift when it's done. So obviously for you and your work, that might look different than for a different Red Cross responder. But when it's time to go home, you go home. And when you go home, you switch back to what else is going on in your life and your family and all those other things that make up your life. It can't be that it's bleeding into everything. And you have to stay connected to your personal support system in a way that works for you. Typically, disaster responders are working 12-hour shifts, longer if you're in a leadership position. So those are pretty long hours, and so you need to learn how to take a break, connect with family, come back to the work you need to do. So when we are trying to initially connect with the client from the psychological first aid perspective, obviously we're introducing ourselves and we're trying to be fully present. mindful attention, giving them the body language, culturally appropriate body language that lets them know that there you are and you are deeply listening to them. And in the Red Cross, we're often making a connection by having to approach clients ourselves. Your experience might be different because clients are probably coming to you, I suspect, most of the time. Yes? Yeah, okay. So you're not having to like cold call, approach somebody and greet them unless you're maybe working at a resource center or something like that where there's a lot of people and they're all gravitating there to try to access resources, and then you might be actually having to make these initial connections. But obviously we just want to provide uninterrupted mindful presence. We want to help people be safe. Obviously, if there's some kind of medical emergency or mental health emergency, again, you follow your own procedures that are established by your entity. But we do need to intervene when there are immediate concerns for safety. But there's also other ways we can make people feel safe. And so some of the ways we can make people feel safe is by trying to display kindness, calmness, and compassion. So I know all of you are very busy people, but I'm just curious, what ideas do you have about how do you display kindness, calmness, and compassion? Smiling, great. Other thoughts? Oh, come on, I know all of you are kind people. How do you do that? Yes?
Expressing condolences when people say things that are troubling.
Sure, yeah, so like even just non-verbally responding like, yes, I am tracking this conversation, I am here, I'm giving you eye contact, I'm present with you, I'm not too detached and removed and over here in my paperwork, nor am I like aggressively present, I'm just present. And so by establishing a kind and supportive environment, it ultimately makes things more collaborative. In the Red Cross, when you're working with clients in shelters or in other settings, we also do things like maybe hand a person a water bottle, or if they're cold, we hand them a blanket. And these simple gestures of kindness really go a long way for a person to feel safe. But ultimately, in order to provide an atmosphere that's comfortable, we want to express patience, even if people are being difficult. So that's kind of hard to do. But we want to make sure that we're speaking in a voice that's calm. We try to remain courteous and respectful, irrespective of how another person might be acting. And we try to pay attention to signs of cultural appropriateness in terms of physical closeness, eye contact, and gestures. So obviously a disaster can bring all kinds of different clients to be requiring services, and we can't treat everybody the same, and we can't assume that one way of speaking or being is fine with all clients. Just as an example, when I arrived to Louisiana, my first day I was briefed there, and they were briefing like 100 of us, and they said, okay, all of you need to speak way slower because the community feels disrespected. You are speaking too fast. That was really informative for me. I was like, okay, I'm clearly going to unintentionally bother someone because I'm trying to speak in my normal animated voice, and that is not culturally appropriate here. Really good feedback. I've already mentioned these things here. In terms of cultural appropriateness, sometimes you can just ask clients what's culturally appropriate or what feels comfortable for them. If you notice that they're giving you body language that they're uncomfortable, you can say, is there anything I can do that could make you more comfortable? Is this place that I'm sitting at, is that okay with you? Would you prefer that I scoot back a little bit? If you're talking to a group of people, you ask who is the head of your household. We don't make any assumptions. If you're interacting with a group of people, you can ask them who is family to you. We don't make an assumption about what their family structure is. We let clients inform us of those things. And so we want to make sure that we are not doing anything that's intrusive or culturally inappropriate. And work in general, especially disaster-related work, can be really chaotic and intense. Sometimes we can be caught off guard and not really aware of how we are relating to others. And so when we're frustrated, we might be impolite without meaning to be that way. And I think apologies go a really long way in general, is just to say, especially if you notice that someone is shutting down or becoming more agitated, maybe take a step back and say, I'm sorry, let me try that again. Or I'm sorry, I noticed that maybe I said something that didn't quite land with you. Can we revisit that one more time? Because when people are in a heightened state of stress, their nervous system is, activated. And so they're much more sensitive than they might be at another time. And we might have that awareness, and so be extra careful and considerate. Like I said, if you find you've said something you wish you didn't, you can always apologize. Even saying something like, I'm sorry I didn't let you finish what you were saying, or I'm sorry if your feelings were hurt. Really sort of rudimentary things that we might not think about, but or take for granted, but would go a long way in these kinds of conversations. So if you were to think about a client who's showing up to you and they have this unique situation that many of us might not have to ever deal with, where they are staying in a shelter and they don't even know if they have clean underwear for tomorrow, and they're eating food that's not part of their normal diet. They're sleeping in a room with 200 other snoring people, and the lights turn on at 6 a.m. So they're showing up and maybe meeting with you, let's say in that kind of situation. How might you meet that client's basic needs before shifting to the other work you want to do? Any thoughts? What are your basic needs? Wonderful. Yeah. Do you need to take a few minutes? I think is that what you said? Yeah. Coffee. Doing some coffee, something warm to drink. A few minutes to collect yourself. Lovely. Yeah. Maybe they rushed and they're frantic, and you can tell they just need a minute to sit. What else might you do? Or what else might you need in that kind of situation? Yes. Some people just need to vent. Absolutely. So, in some of my work in the Red Cross, sometimes I'm meeting with a person. I very much have an objective for that meeting. I'm not just there to maybe listen, but I need to make sure that I've structured in my own mind and in my presence a little bit of time to just allow for venting to take place. I sort of view my work in these kinds of settings as I'm walking in with a bucket, and the client gets to put in that bucket whatever they may need. And I need to carry that, and then later I need to figure out how to clean my bucket and start all over again. But yeah, just giving a little bit of mindful time for them to share whatever it is that they need to share. Because if they can tell you that they're really stressed out about this experience, or they're so overwhelmed by that, and their 5-year-old isn't sleeping, and their 18-year-old is missed out on school, you might feel like, yeah, that's not what we're here to talk about. But they need to say those things to someone, and maybe if you're just a validating, supportive presence, they can then feel heard and move on to other topics. I think of basic needs as things like, the restroom's over here in case you need to go. Feel free to get up anytime if that's what you need. Would you like a drink of water? If I notice that the client is feeling very overwhelmed in the conversation, I might stop for a second let's just take a breath. I know this is a lot. Let's take the smallest piece of this. Again, in more of some of the Red Cross settings where you're out in the community or out at a shelter, you have access to things like being able to direct them to additional services they might need, check in with who they are with to make sure that they're supported. If there's health concerns, direct them to appropriate medical services. But one of the things we can all do is encourage healthy behaviors. Now, you are not these clients' therapists, but you still might be able to say to a client, I know you've got a lot going on, but if there's any way you could try to really prioritize sleeping and eating, that's going to go a long way. And you can say that to a person. You don't have to be an expert. You just know that this is what all human beings need. Sometimes if a client is really upset or agitated, maybe it's helpful that you either take a break, or if you can, get up, walk with them for a second, or invite them to do something like that before or after your meeting, and then offer them, of course, additional mental health support as possible or as needed. I basically check in with anybody that I'm meeting, regardless of what role or hat I'm in. How are you sleeping? When have you eaten? How much water have you had? Can we take care of any of that right now? Okay, great. Now we're probably in a better place to meet. as we are listening, we want to be really attentive, listen carefully, show that we are available, and avoid getting too attached. So there's a fine line between being an empathic, supportive presence and then getting over-involved, right? Emotionally, especially. So we are really feeling that person's pain. We have to find a way to hold a boundary there. So for some clients, for example, when they're stressed, they like to talk about it. And for other people, they're going to completely shut down and not want to talk about it at all. So if someone is really shut down, one thing you might be able to do is ask how a loved one is doing. That's generally much safer. So they might be able to say how their spouse is doing or how their child is doing. And in that, you can hear maybe some of their own concerns, even if it doesn't feel safe for them to directly say to you, well, I'm sleeping terribly and I can't stop worrying about the next time I'm going to be able to go back to my house. In psychological first aid, we really walk the line of letting clients share what they want to share, but not prying or asking excessive questions. So if someone doesn't wish to talk about something, we don't make them do so. But if they are sharing something, we're trying to be attentive and listening. And ultimately, we want to help people feel less anxious and worried. Sometimes just being there and not saying anything at all, but just non-verbally showing that you are listening can be very comforting to an individual. If you notice that a given client is bonding with you too much, you might want to make sure that you're taking care of that in some way, because then when you are done working with them or when you have to leave, you don't want it to be an additional loss that they're going through. We unfortunately don't have much time to spend on that topic, but I did want to make that point.
What's a good example to help break that? Kind of like just a few words that you could say, just so that you can break it off respectfully, or you can walk away and talk about being attached or something.
I mean, if it's a person you're not meeting with again, let's say, or you're done with your work with them, you can just maybe just say something like, I really wish you all the best, just sort of trying to provide like this is the end without saying that so firmly, best wishes to you. I try to say something of that form. If a client is like really wanting or needing a lot out of you, you might at times just need to explicitly say, I'm sorry, I'm very limited in what I wish I could help you more, but I'm very limited in what I can do, or these are the primary things we really need to focus on. And I know these other things you have going on are really, really important, but unfortunately, I'm not the person that will be able to help you with those things. However, maybe there's these other resources, again, you can access. I think there's times in which you even need to be more explicit, where you can say, I know this is really important for you, and I really want you to be able to talk to somebody about it. I hope that you have a close person, a friend, a pastor. Here's this 1-800 number you can call, and I hope that you can get support from somebody around these other things. Does that sort of help? Yeah. Tricky area. When we're giving clients reassurance, it's very important that the reassurance is helpful. So first and foremost, it can go a long way just to let a person know that what they're thinking and feeling is understandable because of what they experienced. So the range of reactions that people have range from, again, seemingly they seem totally normal, unaffected, to they're extremely shut down, they're depressed, they're ranging all the way to maybe like suicidal and can't move, hopeless, to they're frustrated, they're angry, they're agitated, they resort to coping behaviors that are not helpful for them. So there's quite a range, and really all of it is across a continuum of what's normal. Like if something happened to us that flipped over our whole world, we also wouldn't act normal, whatever that actually means. And so we want to make sure not to minimize a client's reactions. We want to instead help them feel validated. Depending on the situations, the majority of the initial symptoms a client is experiencing will go away on its own naturally. That's because we are quite resilient as people, and the body and everything else wants to go back to normal. However, the more a person suppresses their experience, doesn't deal with it, doesn't work through their emotions, or tries to avoid, that's where down the line research shows things like PTSD develop. We want to encourage good coping. There's various different ways of coping in stressful situations, some of which are positive and some of which are negative. If you were to think about examples of negative or not so helpful coping behaviors, what do you imagine some of those might be? Drinking, sure. Anything else? What was that? Sleeping? Sleeping, yeah. So certainly oversleeping. Yep. Anything else? Say that again? Hitting your kid, yeah, or acting out in any way that's aggressive or anything like that, sure. And we all have our ways, you know, we're talking about some maybe extreme behaviors. We all have our ways that we cope that are not so good. So when we learn that a client might be resorting to not so helpful coping strategies, we may suggest that they find something else that would be more helpful instead. And again, I recognize you have a line of how much can you get into these kinds of conversations with a client. Some not so helpful strategies include things like overeating, abusing drugs or alcohol, taking unnecessary risk. It's not uncommon for people who've experienced a high degree of anxiety or a really depressing situation to sort of go into what I call screw it mode. And so they're just doing things that might seem relatively reckless. People can be verbally or physically abusive. People can also isolate and spend too much time on their own. And this is in contrast to things that might be positive coping strategies, things like maintaining a routine, making lists of tasks that actually seem feasible to accomplish, and trying to maintain more of a here and now in the moment perspective. So one of the things that I do is 1 week a month, I supervise a team that goes out to local disasters. And just to give you a scope, I literally just got this email half an hour ago because I asked for the most updated information. So between July and October, we're talking 4 months, across eastern North Carolina, we had 466 cases opened and serviced 1,368 clients. That's in 4 months. So these are small-scale disasters, car through the house, fire, tree falling, still disasters that are taking place. And when I show up and I'm trying to work with a client, I pretty quickly will get into a conversation with them around what are ways that they can stay a little bit more present focused. I'll say, there's a lot that you're going to need to do, especially in the weeks to come. I'm going to encourage you to take this one day at a time. What is the smallest piece you can do that's in support of your recovery? And if you can imagine how a typical client may work with you and the things that you might be asking them to complete as task, imagine cutting that in half, because maybe that's all that's feasible for them in that moment. Other things that help are setting short-term goals, doing things that help them maintain a healthy lifestyle. This could be resting, movement, eating as healthy as possible. If they have any spiritual or other meaningful activities, trying to connect with those, connecting with family and friends, writing or keeping a journal, listening to music, all of these might be positive coping strategies. You can encourage people to do this if you notice that they're having a hard time. And you can just sprinkle these things lightly into a conversation, and even if, again, your primary role isn't in a mental health capacity. It's really important to help people connect to others. If someone's really isolated or they don't know if their loved ones are well, they're going to be completely preoccupied by that. So a few resources for that include things like the Safe and Well website. You can literally show that to a client or maybe walk them through it. This is where they can actually check in, and when a person arrives at a shelter, for example, they will usually be logged in the Safe and Well website so that you know, Auntie who lives in Wilmington, let's check if she logged in, if we can tell that maybe she got evacuated and she's safe. There's also things like on Facebook, the marking safe for people who use that, and encouraging other methods of communication. If phone lines are down, maybe it's possible for a person to reach out in a different way to loved ones. Same thing with workers. So if you are in the middle of a disaster response, you need to find your own ways to connect to your people. If their immediate support system is somehow not available to them, I'll try to encourage clients to find a proxy of that. So if they're staying in a shelter, for example, disaster spiritual care will often be there. If they're in a recovery program, often AA groups will stop by and hold a meeting. It might be possible for them to go to a local church. It's not their church, but it's still a church that they can come to and feel welcomed. So having some sense of support is one of the primary resilience factors that we can help people connect with. Giving accurate and timely information is particularly important as a disaster is unfolding or as you are working on a particular project. Clients need accurate and timely information, and especially when we are stressed, we tend to get even more concrete. We really want to know information as precisely as possible. So I've gotten really comfortable with being able to say, I don't know, when I really don't know something. It's so much better than saying, well, I think it's this, and a person really latches onto that idea, and then they're facing yet another disappointment, and it's equally shocking all over again. So that might be something that you can think about is whatever information that you're giving them, try to make sure it's reliable and timely. And if it's something that's subject to change, give that disclaimer or let them know, here's a way you can check whether this information is still accurate. Yes, there's this resource center that's open, but they tend to close really fast before you go. Please make sure that it's still open before you go there, just as an example. So in the work that you're doing, you may at times find that the client has additional needs that you are not able to take on in the scope that you're working with them. So these things like find out who your supervisor is, that's if you're a Red Cross volunteer, but there are ways for you to connect clients with Red Cross Disaster Mental Health. So when there's an operation taking place, basically it works like a giant military table of organization, and there's always a disaster mental health worker up at the very top. You can connect to a regional disaster director and let them know that there's a community of people or a group of people that need a referral. Where is the closest way that they can access those services, and you can pass that information on. At the end of the talk, I will also give you a 1-800 number that is particularly useful through SAMHSA for disaster distress. So again, obviously there might be other procedures that are in place for you of when you decide to refer to disaster mental health, but I will say too that you can access disaster mental health. If you have worked with a lot of people and you are experiencing disaster stress, doesn't mean that you are kooky or falling apart or all these other terribly stigmatizing words. It just means that it might be helpful to talk with someone who's experienced in this that can help you find a different place or be more at ease. Obviously, coming back to this idea of ending the conversation, so if it's a single contact, I will typically wrap up the conversation by saying, okay, so here's a review, here's what we've talked about. A client that is really stressed and overwhelmed might benefit from having information written down for them or themselves, writing it down so they clearly remember. I'll review that with them. I'll ask them if there's anything else I can do to assist them. If there's phone numbers or resources, I provide that. And then we find a way to end that interaction. I think the hardest part in doing some of this work is, again, that sense of things being not complete or not being able to totally solve a problem for another person. And that's where we might need to then go home and have a really good self-care routine around how do we tolerate those feelings. So as you get ready to apply your psychological first aid skills, you should remember to do things like be tolerant, including of people behaving more irregularly or erratically or different than you might expect. You try to keep appropriate boundaries while still being warm and kind and present. You respect people's privacy, and when something is outside of your scope or something shows up that you don't really know how to deal with, to ask for help. So you're likely to encounter people, especially in a disaster response, again, because communities really shift and people migrate and things like that. You might encounter people that are different than the clientele you're used to working with, or people who are just different than you. And being tolerant means treating all people with respect and dignity. Now, sometimes practicing tolerance can be difficult. Let's say a person is telling you about something that's very inconsistent with a value system that you may have, but you're still trying to provide warm, compassionate care, indiscriminate of that. But as being volunteers and doing the work that you do, I know that all of you have already demonstrated that you have a commitment to helping others through difficult times, irrespective of individual differences. In terms of keeping boundaries, we want to make sure that when we are reaching out to others, we don't overstep any kind of boundaries. So there's times in which a client might be wanting to figure something out, and their preference is, for example, to go home and talk it over with the matriarch of the family before they're going to make a decision. So it's my job to not be pushy and to respect that that's what they need to do. That's just an example, but we want to make sure that our help is actually helpful, and sometimes that means we need to see things more from how the client wants to approach the issue rather than the most efficient way that we have in mind. We might offend people by pushing people to talk when they don't want to, asking for information that's either too much and too soon. We might also not be respecting a client's wishes to not be referred to other resources, including things like mental health services. So whenever I offer any kind of resources, I tend to do it in this very invitational sort of way of, some people find it helpful in this kind of situation to talk to someone. I tend to not say disaster mental health. I just say there's a counselor or someone who would be really happy to listen and support you. But there might be, again, other kinds of resources, too, that you need to respect a client's desire to not engage with. You may overstep boundaries by doing things like telling people what to do and not to do. Self-agency is really important, but especially when your world feels chaotic, you want to try to help a client connect with the greatest sense of control that they can possibly access. So if I'm, for example, trying to problem solve with a client and everything that I'm saying, they coming up with, well, no, I can't do that, and no, that won't be possible, and I can't see how that could be feasible either, I might practice turning the tables and say, okay, well, here's the situation we find ourselves in. What ideas do you have about how to solve this? And now I've taken a little bit of the pressure off of myself, but I've also shifted the power dynamic where instead of kind of engaging in this discussion that's not going anywhere, maybe I'm empowering the person to solve or generate more problem solving for their given situation. Sometimes when we also share our own personal views, values, and beliefs, it's not welcomed or it's crossing a boundary. So we want to be careful with connecting with people that makes them feel like we are both human, but maybe not getting too much into our own experiences or anything that ends up imposing a value judgment. And obviously, we don't want to become too involved, neither with clients nor with potentially other people that are working in a disaster area, because again, that can be challenging. When you provide psychological first aid, it's likely that you will hear many personal stories. And I know that you already have that from the experiences of the clients that you serve. Obviously, it's important not to share these stories with anyone, so we want to maintain privacy and confidentiality. And when information is shared with you that implies that there's a sense of danger that's immediate, you must inform a supervisor or you must reach out to appropriate mental health services. I want to quickly debunk a myth that people often have. It does not introduce any thoughts of suicide if you ask a person if they want to harm or hurt themselves, so it never hurts to ask. If you get that creepy feeling in your belly and you're like, oh, I just am not sure, just ask. Because if the answer is no, then the answer is no. And if the answer is yes or it's maybe, you're not tipping them over the edge. Instead, you're just opening the door for a conversation. And there's always ways to make a person aware there are ways to make someone aware that a person is in need of help without revealing every detail that individual told you. So when you are going to a supervisor or talking to someone else, obviously be mindful of how much do you really need to disclose that's personal to actually figure out what's the next step you need to take. So these principles that we're talking about, often they go a long way. Sometimes that's not enough. Some people will need additional support. I'll come back to that as it relates to resources. Again, making a referral when necessary is something we might need to be comfortable with. A quick list of behavior do's and don'ts. So when we are communicating with someone, we want to convey open, available, non-aggressive body language. So we sit facing and directly beside or in front of the person we're interacting with. We try to make appropriate eye contact depending on cultural expectations. So if I'm interacting with a client and they're being very direct, I will try to mirror that same eye contact. If I notice a client is frequently looking down or looking away, I will similarly do the same. I won't continue to direct my eye contact in this intense way. I convey that I'm attentive by just listening actively. If they're saying something, I might repeat back, okay, let me make sure that I got that right. Here's what I heard you say, or I'm hearing this from you. I understand that this is what you're going through. And I usually make an explicit agreement with the client of there might be things that I don't get quite right, and I really want you to feel comfortable with telling me and stopping me if there's something I misunderstood or something that I said that didn't quite land with you. We don't want to sit back, fold our arms, look around, appear distracted, or walk away from a client. Obviously, these seem things we might take for granted, but when a person is seemingly not very engaged with us, it becomes easier to resort to body language that is also not particularly receptive. So in terms of what to say and how you say it, these are, again, some sample verbiages. It sounds like this may have been a very difficult, frustrating, frightening, or stressful situation. Is there anything I can do for you right now? Not things like, well, you should be thankful that this happened, or it could have been worse. That doesn't sound so bad. You should hear what this other person went through. Or things like, it must have been God's will, or you really shouldn't feel that way, or don't feel guilty, bad, or nervous. So some of these might be so, they're coming from a really good place. We're wanting a person to feel better, but actually we are completely invalidating their experience. So I want to talk briefly about vicarious trauma, because when we are dealing with folks in general that are carrying a lot, it's possible that we're going to be affected by it. So when I'm saying vicarious trauma, what I'm referring to is this indirect experience of a traumatic situation. So there might be somebody else that was injured or is going through a near-death experience or someone dying, and then there's an impact that lands. And I really love this particular way of thinking about it, the emotional residue from exposure. So if you notice sometimes that a client left the room and your body is still feeling something like heavy or tense, or your heart rate's a little bit up, that might be an example of like what that might feel like. You are now impacted by something that you heard about. Now, in terms of vicarious trauma, it doesn't just come from direct client interactions. It comes from witnessing an experience, hearing about it, seeing related images. So exposure to news, for example, I really encourage people to modulate that. When something's going on, it's easy to get really absorbed in the news, and you keep tracking, and then you keep seeing these images, and they're awful, and they're upsetting, and now you can't sleep. And I really tell people, okay, well, maybe check what you really need to check, and then stop, cut it off, because otherwise you're absorbing more than you can actually process. But in the case of vicarious trauma, we are impacted by the pain, fear, terror that others have endured. So what does this look like? Well, it can look like a person who had themselves survived a trauma, loss of joy, not being able to do enjoyable activities, having a bleak perspective and not being able to find humor, feeling low or down, or in a larger scale, feeling depressed, being consumed with worry thoughts, feeling more on edge or irritable, feeling physically tense, on guard, watchful, or having difficulty with sleep, having intrusive thoughts, images, or nightmares, difficulty using coping skills that they may typically turn to, or maintaining a normal routine, increasing use of alcohol or drugs, impaired appetite or overeating, avoiding, disengaging, or withdrawing, excessive feelings of guilt, and feelings of hopelessness. So these things are the exact same kind of things you may see adults displaying if they are experiencing disaster-related stress. But if you see someone who works with individuals who've gone through disasters, displaying some of these signs, they might be experiencing vicarious trauma. So some risk factors for care providers, and I view all of you as care providers in this situation, are things like yourselves having to manage a disaster recovery. So if you're volunteering in an area, but your house got flooded too, that's a risk factor. If you're working with cultures, language, or customs that are unfamiliar, that's just going to make you a little bit more uneasy, having to track a little bit more of what you're doing. If you're having difficulty staying in touch with your own family, or if you're concerned about events going on at home, your own kids are, like, their school is closed and you don't know how you're going to take care of childcare. Now there's something cooking on that back burner and it's a little bit harder to be fully present with this client in front of you. If you witness serious or fatal injuries, particularly of children, of people known to them or coworkers, that's a risk factor. Seeing catastrophic destruction, including of like architectural structure or infrastructure. If you yourself experienced your life being in danger, whether it's current or it has already passed. If you've talked with many grieving or upset people with significant losses, those are all risk factors. And the two at the bottom, I think, are ones that I see quite a bit, especially when people are trying to finish work with a client or they're going home from a disaster response. One is repeatedly thinking that you didn't do enough. That just is a guilt that we might carry, or feeling guilty that things are left incomplete or there's this situation you were just unable to help. So if those things are burdening us, the more we have of these, the more likely it is that we might experience vicarious trauma or otherwise have difficulty coping. So on the flip side of vicarious trauma, I want to briefly talk about components of resilience. So we need our own plan, that how do we get our car oil changed for stress management. And we ourselves might need to go back to the basics and do things like, okay, I'm going to set goals for myself that are just for the day, just for these next 24 hours, the smallest task that I can manage to take on. And I'm not going to isolate. I need to connect with at least one person who is going to provide an empathic presence for me, because that is a protective factor. I'm wondering how many of you are familiar with the ACEs study, the Adverse Childhood Experience? I'll chime in about that in a minute, but it's this enormous study that was done that looked at all of these adverse childhood experiences that children go through, and then long-term predictors of the worst healthcare outcomes. And one of the best things that can serve as a buffer, not just for children, but for adults against traumatic experiences, is having at least one person that you can go talk to. Now, for some clients, you might be that one person. That's kind of a lot, is to know that that might be the case. You need to access your own social and emotional skills. I wish I had time to train you in some of those, but unfortunately that's beyond this scope. But we do need to find a way to make meaning, even if things feel very bleak or hopeless. We need to remember, why is it that I do this work that I do, or all these things went wrong, but what is the good thing that I tried to do or accomplish? What is a success or a win that I have if I can find it? Or even if a situation is particularly devastating, if you can just remind yourself of other good that's happening in the world that can help you maintain a more balanced perspective. So a few quick resources. This resource I tend to hand out like no tomorrow when I'm working with clients dealing with a disaster. This is the SAMHSA Disaster Distress Hotline. I put both the website up and the number. What's really neat about this resource, it's a free 24-hour hotline that clients can call, and they'll be connected with a counselor they can talk to. They also have services for people who are hearing impaired. They have multiple language support. And online you can download a brochure that's really nice to just hand someone if you need it. Otherwise, I just give the phone number and encourage them to call. Is anyone still copying that down? No? Okay. Realize this is teeny tiny, but, and maybe there's a way that you guys can have a copy of this slide. Perfect, thank you. So other resources that are on here that I'll just quickly jog through. First is the ready.gov website that has information about disaster preparedness by disaster type. So we're in North Carolina, we're mostly dealing with hurricanes and some flooding. You can help clients be prepared if you have notice of something like that going on. It will literally give things like checklists of what could they do to be more prepared. This diversitypreparedness.org has resources for culturally diverse communities that can be really useful. The next one is a handout from the Red Cross called Taking Care of Your Emotional Health After a Disaster. I also give this out fairly liberally. It just reminds people of good coping skills and things that they may need to do to restore emotional health. The National Child Traumatic Stress Network is a phenomenal resource. You can go in there and look up by age group, by situation or disaster type, what kind of resources are available. So you can search by audience type, like is this a resource for the parent? Is this a resource for the child? And again, maybe some of this is outside of your scope, but you might find that you use this for a friend or a neighbor or somebody else rather than with a client. Sesame Street also has great toolkits. They have like, I've had a fire toolkit, and you know, Elmo now doesn't know where he's gonna stay. And even things like a divorce toolkit. Those are wonderful for age-appropriate children. There's also this website for preparedness and recovery in older adults and the disaster distress helpline that we just talked about. So in the last couple of moments, I just want to leave time for any burning questions. Yes?
I don't know if this is also outside the scope. I've seen in some of my work helping to coordinate pro bono volunteers, you know, and this is not to, I'm not calling out anyone in particular, but sometimes there's a feeling that, you know, people don't seem grateful enough, and not even just pro bono attorneys, but other service areas, and just, you know, I've always wondered, you know, someone who's in the midst of a trauma might not present with their own full emotional selves, and so they might not seem like they're welcoming the help or grateful for it, or I also often hear, oh, people don't want help and they don't follow through in deadlines and stuff. Have you seen, like, is there a way to help people understand how to interpret other people's trauma and that sort of, does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think in the work I do, and when I'm also in so many different capacities volunteering, I try to remember that my role is, it's an offering. And if it's an offering, then I'm giving it unconditionally. I'm giving it irrespective of whether I'm getting anything in return, including a thank you or a positive attitude. I am there to provide a service, and that is what's meaningful about it for me. But you're absolutely right that if a client has a lot going on, that expression of gratitude, especially verbally, or that expression of I'm receptive to you might not be what you get. But that's why you're showing up. You're trying to be helpful in the worst of situations that clients are dealing with. You are signing up for interacting with people when they are not their ideal self. And obviously, you know, going and like getting explicit consent of like, is this something you would like? Is this something that's helpful? I think that helps increase motivation, because a client might be saying, yeah, well, why is this something that you want to do? Why is this important to you? And if you don't make this change, what's at stake for you, or what might that cost you? You're drumming up a little bit of motivation for that client, and then they're verbalizing why they might actually make some changes. But you can expect, I think, that people may not express gratitude in the way that you might hope or like. Any other questions? That was a great one. Well, it was a pleasure speaking with you today. My email is up there. That's for my practice, and my phone number. I also put on there the North Carolina Disaster Response Network. So I'm the co-chair of the task force that oversees this network, where we work with all of the LME MCOs in North Carolina to coordinate care for clients. But also, as part of the disaster task force, there's several of us across all disciplines of mental health that are really passionate about providing trainings. So if there's further needs or things like that that come across, please don't hesitate to reach out to us and we can see how we can be of help. So thank you all of you for your attentive presence this afternoon, and thank you for all of the work that you're doing to service clients and wherever you are from.